Today we're taking a look at rocks, boulders, cliffs, in particular about the shape, how to see them and simplify them so they're easier to paint, and then also the color, especially in the shadows. Colors in the shadows, along with reflected light affecting the shadows. There's always a lot of reflected light in rocks and boulders and cliffs, especially on a sunlit day when the light's bouncing in the shadows and giving us more color. Color is affected by two things in the shadows. One is local color, in other words, the color of the rock itself, whether it's kind of a grayish blue, gray orange, gray yellow. There's all kinds of different colors, usually some kind of grayish color. And that color will be in the shadow because of the local color. Just like a red apple is red because that's the local color because it's a red apple. But also the color of the light bouncing into it. So we'll look at a couple of those, a couple of references, and look at how the reflected light affects the shadows, and then reducing the shape of the rock and the detail so that it's easier to see and easier to paint. Starting with this photograph, this is in Madeira Canyon here in Arizona. And we have, several big rocks here. If I'm painting something like this, I want to decide how I can simplify. One way is to get rid of just tons of little rocks or eliminate some. The other way is to maybe pull two or three shapes together and create one rock and maybe move them slightly so they're overlapping or not directly on top of each other, but move it over so it's kind of behind. So arranging them compositionally, again, pulling some together, like this would make one big rock here. Or I could maybe turn it into two. But we don't have to paint every rock. I could eliminate these. I could eliminate one or two of these. Because it gets too cluttered, it becomes hard to paint, hard for the viewer to see. The idea is to simplify and make the painting work as far as being, again, simpler to see and paint. So when I look at these, first thing I want to do with boulders and rocks is make them a bit more angular. I tend to angle or sharpen some of these edges here instead of rounding everything off. Make some of these a bit more angular. Not that I can have a rounded rock, but like this one right here, it's going to just look more three-dimensional. It's going to look like it's more solid, has some weight to it if it's angular. If everything is real rounded, looks a little bit like a marshmallow. So whenever I see lines or angles or the form, the outside form, I want to sharpen the edges a bit more. Again, not all of it all the time, but for the most part, I want to really sharpen a lot of these angles. The other thing is to simplify them in terms of value, and that's to see the shapes on the rocks in terms of three sides, because you're going to see 2 to 3 sides if we see it, if we think of just a basic rock here. Here we have, well, let's start with this big one here. I have the front side in here. It has a definite shape to it that's catching light. Then maybe another top, another side, the form changes. And then the shadow has these 2 sides. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4. Of course, the rock can have a lot of different angles to it, but we're trying to simplify. But generally at least 3, so that I have, like in this one, there's 1 here on top, 1 here, and then 1 here. Here I'm not going to see 4 because these sides are fairly flat. Same thing here. I've got basically the top part, a side here, and then another side here. And I want to simplify the rocks so those are really sticking out. In other words, really separate those changes, even more so maybe than the photograph shows. Then the other thing, simplify the values. So I went ahead and blocked them out. And every time a plane changes a different direction, the value is going to change. And I try and keep it to 3, because again, the goal is to simplify. So the light value are the areas, the planes on the rock that are facing the sunlight. Sun's coming this way. And then either a half tone on the light side will be a little darker, and then the shadow's darkest. Although these aren't halftones. There's no halftones on this rock. There's just different values of shadow. Again, even in the shadow, I've got a plane here and then a plane here. both in shadow, but it's changing direction, so the value has to change. And the simpler we can keep those values, the easier it is to paint. So I don't want to get it too complicated. Like this one here, I've got the lights there, and then I've got 3 shadow areas there. These could probably be a little bit different value, but the simpler the better. So don't try and see too much too fast. And that's what I'm doing to all these rocks as I separate the values. I want it to look like this more than this. Too much detail. Now I could add as much detail once I get in here. I can add some smaller darks, some of the lights in here. There's some dark shapes, shadows. There's a few maybe darker accents in the shadow. But the basic values is a simple light and simple dark. Again, maybe 2 or 3 values of dark, but they're still all in the shadow. And if I can start out with just a simple light, simple dark, and a halftone. I don't have much halftone in this photograph, but we'll talk about halftone in a minute. Then the reflected light. We have, of course, you get reflected light on sunny days, a lot of sunlight. So the sunlight is coming here, and then it's bouncing back into the shadow area. And I want to be able to show that in there. Now in the photograph itself, you can see it. That glows a lot more. It's a little warmer than the shadow up here. They're both shadow, and they're both cool compared to the light, but this shadow has a bit more warmth. So after blocking it in, I will mix up maybe some kind of yellow-orange, orange to red-orange, and wipe most of it off my brush. In other words, I want it very thin. Not thin as far as a lot of medium or paint thinner in it, not like a watercolor thin, but just wiping it off the brush. Then I can drag it. At the computer, it's just the equivalent of making it less opaque. And then as it goes this way, it doesn't get quite as well. But that's the effect I want. The thing about the reflected light, though, is I don't want that lighter reflection in the shadow to be as light as the light area. Because once that happens, then it becomes another light source. Reflected light is somewhat of a light source, but it doesn't turn the shadow into a light area. It still needs to be a shadow. So make sure this reflected light in the shadow is still darker than the light. So I've reduced the values. In this rock here, up above here, I've got 1 light and I've got 2 darks. And that works along with the reflected light. Now I can carry it further, get some dark accents in the shadow, and maybe some darks in the light area to break it up. And that's detail, but sometimes it needs some detail. Same thing here, the light's hitting this patch right here and bouncing into this shadow. So I can come back, and that's a bit too much. So again, I'd wipe more off my brush. As long as I have it the right value, it's gonna work. Now I can get it a little too warm, but as long as it doesn't get as light as in the sunlight. But that adds some subtle changes in the shadow, and that always makes the color of the painting look more refined. The more subtle color variations we can get, without much of a value change, if any, the better the painting is going to work. And subtle color changes are a lot better than detail. In other words, not dark and light changes, which is detail, but just color changes. Now, going to another one here. Same thing here. When I look at these rocks, I've got a definite light area. These light areas, 1 value, the shadows, 1 value. Then I can always come back and make changes. Add these darker darks, add some reflected light. Even if I don't see it in the photograph, the sunlight's going to hit here, then it's going to bounce into here. And maybe a little bit here and here. Same thing here in the water, this light will bounce up in here. It doesn't show that much in the photograph, but the more I can add of that, the better it's going to look. That subtlety and color changes really makes it work well. When I look at this rock, I want to simplify the shapes to probably just 1 right in here, in a shape here, shape, and then shape. And each one of those is a different value. They're all shadow. These 2 are kind of close in value. This one's a little lighter and this one's a lot lighter. But simplify those shapes and values. And once I get it filled in, I can do more to it. Same thing with this. This is in the Grand Canyon, which is a great place for reflected light and, of course, rocks and cliffs. Here the sunlight is coming this way. Shadows are here, and you can really see the light hitting here and bouncing there and there. Really warms that up. Not so much here, it's a little cooler. And you look at this shadow, this is a lot cooler because it's not getting any reflected light. It's more of a muted blue-violet. This is a muted orange, cool down orange because it's in the shadow. And I want to look for that, and or I want to put it in if I don't see it, because it really makes a big difference getting that reflected light. And that, coupled with getting the right planes on the rock and cliff and simplifying it. So I simplify this first with just 2 values. You know, there's a lot of nice darks in here and accents and there's a couple of values in the light area. But I want this first. Simplify it first. I have 3 pretty much, just 3 planes. The light, dark, and then up here I've got a couple of values of the green. And that makes it simple. This is cool. This is warm. So I've got the effect of sunlight on it. Then I can come back while this is still wet. And I'll do the same thing. I'll get a red-orange. And it could be the equivalent of cad yellow light with a little bit of alizarin, or cad yellow light with red, cadmium red, cad orange with maybe a tiny bit of blue in it. Again, wipe it off the brush and add some. In other words, I want it very thin. But it has to stay on the shadow side. Now that's more of a yellow shadow. I could go more red, add a bit more orange and red instead of the yellow or yellow ochre. Let's get a bit redder. I think that works a little bit better. And again, the light is hitting here and bouncing back in there. And that gives that effect. A little bit more here too. And we'll keep this cooler. This shadow here stays cooler because it's not getting any reflected light, but these are. Then after that, I can start getting some dark accents, but as I'm breaking it up with detail, I want to keep it as simple as possible. Now I do this while it's wet so it'll blend in slightly, but that gives me 2 values, or 3 values now in the shadow. The overall shadow color, the warmer reflected light that blends into it, and then some dark accents which also blend into it. And that gives the shadow some volume. The minute I get at least 2 values in the shadow, of overall shadow and a dark accent for the shadow, it has some form to it. Same thing here. It's also the Grand Canyon. You can see the reflected light in here, and where there's no reflected light, it's going to stay bluer, or again, it's more gray, but more on the bluish side than some red-orange reflected into it. Photographs, well, generally these darks get too dark. These are way too dark. I want a muted blue-violet. That gives it that sense of shadow, because shadow has a color to it. Shadow has blue and violet in it. Then you take into consideration the local color, which is kind of a red-orange. Then on top of that, reflected light, and that's going to give it a lot of variation. Same thing here. Now I simplified these big pile of rocks right here to 3 values. When I look at it, there's a lot more than 3. And I also want to square things off a little bit more. It just reads better. And this is the equivalent of cad yellow light or yellow ochre with dioxazine purple. I will generally mix a gray with blue and orange. And in the shadow, have more blue, make it darker and cooler. And in the sunlight, have more orange, you know, lighter and warmer. But I've got a light, a half tone there, and then a dark. And I have that everywhere. The sunlight hits here directly because the light's coming this way. Then on this side, it's halftone. It's still on the light side. It's getting some light, but not as light as the light area, and then the shadow. And those 3 values give these rocks form and shape, and they look heavy and solid, 3-dimensional. Then I can start with the broken color, getting back into it with red, orange. Then that shadow starts to have some depth to it. It's still cool. I don't want a real warm shadow, but I want a cool shadow that's warmed up a little bit. Then the shadows that face the sky, like this shadow here, if it's angled up so it faces the sky a bit more, it's going to be bluer. And you'll see that a lot. Shadow areas that face the sky in shadow that they're a lot bluer, and the ones that are facing out like this one or facing down catch some of that reflected light and get a little warmer. Now looking at a few paintings here, this is by Edward Pothast, early American Impressionist, and you can see very angular. It makes them look heavy, solid, a definite separation of the sunlight, shadow, and then all this reflected light. Some of these colors might be local color. The rock has some ore in it that's a little warmer, but some of it is reflected light. The light hitting here, coming down, hitting here, and then bouncing back into the shadow. And that's what we want to look for. You can see all the variations. This looks real warm, the shadow here, but it's a violet first, then put the reflected light or the local color in there. But find that big simple shape, like this shadow pattern back in here, very simple. Then he breaks it up with color and maybe one or two more values. And you design your painting like he did here, where all the darks somewhat connect, and it just flows through the whole painting and comes back again. So think about designing your shadow pattern and keeping the values simple. This was Edward Harrison Compton, and very nice painting. You can see the definite separation, dark, light. Shadows are a lot cooler, light areas are warmer, but there's some reflected warm light in the shadows. A lot of it in here where the light's bouncing back, bouncing up into the shadows there. So very angular. This looks more like his work's a little tighter in the studio. This looks more like maybe an outdoor sketch, but very simplified. There's not many values in this shadow right here. Few value changes, but it's that one big overall value that you start with that makes it work. Same thing in here. There's an overall value in this whole area. Then he comes back with some reflected light here and here to warm it up just a little bit. But big, simple shapes, then breaking up the shapes. And like anything else, the more you do it, the more it becomes a little more second nature. This is a John N. King. Again, early American Impressionists. You see the strong separation of temperature. Everything is cool in here and warmer here. They're both gray, but this is more of a bluish, blue-violet gray. And this is more of an orange and blue gray with more orange in it. These look real cool, these rocks right here, but they're a lot warmer than the rocks in the shadows. And that's the big thing, is getting the difference between the warm and the cool. Rocks can look kind of bluish gray or gray. In the sunlight, they have to appear warmer than the shadow. This is another one by John N. King. Again, very cool here. And these, really, really light, but there's a warm yellow tinge to them that separates them from the shadow. Really high key, really light value, and then goes real dark here. This is a William Went, and you can see the reflected light in here, some in here. But what's important is that value change, a simple dark value and a simple light value, and then make a shape out of that that looks interesting. We don't have to copy the shape exactly from the photograph, but we want a definite solid looking shape. And the shapes vary, they're not the same. This is William Went, California Impression. Everything looks like a rock in his paintings. His trees look like rocks, his clouds look like rocks, and of course his rocks look like rock. Focus on those three things: the shape, getting it simple value, and then the color, warm and cool, and then the reflected color.